Um, okay, I'm sitting here with Adam Petway. That's how you say it, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and you had some. I mean, I came across your name. You had some paper on Achilles tendons in NBA players, Achilles tendon ruptures. So yeah, I reached out and wanted to sit down and do a podcast. So here we are. Why don't you tell everyone who you are?
My name's Adam Petway, originally from the United States. I've worked at every level of basketball now you could imagine. My first job out of undergraduate was working at a high school, coaching basketball, teaching, running the strength and conditioning department. I worked D3, mid-major, power 4 or 5, NBA. And currently I'm the or executive director of player health and performance for Seahorses Makawa in the Japanese B League in the top division, in the Nagoya, Japan area. So done a lot of research background, strength and conditioning, performance sports science. In 2017-18, I started data collection to get my PhD in high performance sport with an emphasis on biomechanics, just looking at neuromuscular profiling and training load and match play demands in elite basketball. So done a lot and been blessed to work with a lot of really good athletes and a lot of really good people in my journey, but primarily in the space of biomechanics and basketball. Also dabbled a little bit in track and field, and that's kind of shaped my prism on how I look at basketball. But yeah, primarily the last 17 years have been dedicated to learning everything I can about basketball and basketball performance.
Okay, so what? Why this interest in basketball and biomechanics?
Yes. So, I mean, I guess it stemmed, I grew up in the Atlanta area. There just from our area in Northeast Atlanta, I think there was, 4 or 5 players that ended up going to the NBA. A lot of really good players in basketball. I wasn't one of them, but I always had an affinity for the game and really loved the game. And yeah, I mean, everybody's journey is a little different. I would say, I spent 5 years at the University of Arkansas working for their men's basketball program. And, between London and Rio Olympics, in that time frame, I started going down to the track a lot, and, we had a lot of post-collegiate sprinters that would come back and train with me. And I think that kinda shaped and, gave me a different perspective on biomechanics and speed, power. I think in the 2016 Rio Olympics, as student athletes, the track and field program at Arkansas produced, I wanna say 8 or 9 Olympians and maybe 3 or 4 medals. So kids that got on the podium, not on like Wallace Spearman, Tyson Gay, Veronica Campbell Brown, kids that went to Arkansas and were graduates and post collegiates. I'm talking about, Sandy Morris, Jarian Lawson, Omar McLeod, kids that were in school. So that kind of piqued my interest as far as speed, power, and track and field. It's good that I kind of kept my foot in that door. But yeah, man, I've always had a passion for hoops, and basketball is such an amazing sport. And you know what I'll say is this is my first time doing it internationally, and it's really gaining traction globally in popularity. There's 450 athletes in the NBA. Currently 175 are international, right? And I think if you look, at the distribution of that per decade, per half decade, it's going to just continue to grow, right? So I think it's a beautiful game, and I think coming over here to Japan gives me an appreciation and a respect for how good the players are internationally. I mean, FIBA with different rules. Um, there's no defensive 3 seconds. They let you play a lot more physical in FIBA. You can crowd the ball off the rim, which is wild if you have a really good big and a really like athletic shot blocking big. But for the most part, this experience has kind of opened my eyes to like how good the rest of the world is in the sport that the United States has traditionally dominated.
When you were at Arkansas, and so maybe you were already getting into like speed, power in terms of like helping the basketball players, and then you go to the track and you see track and field. What type of differences are there? So like I'm thinking I've heard of this in, like the purist track and field mindset of speed and power, and then you have a basketball cohort where it's like you have bigs and you have guards, and everyone might do things a little bit differently. Yeah, how did that help you getting out on the track to see that type of speed, power, strength versus basketball?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Jay. I'll never forget this. So there was a really good 200-meter sprinter. that I was just fortunate enough. He just walked in the weight room one day and was like, "Hey, I hear you're pretty good. I'm back in town. I want you to train me." And, in full transparency at the time, just being young and kind of, I guess, ignorant to the situation, I didn't even know who he was. He was like, "My name's Wallace Spearman." I was like, "All right, man, I'll train you. Yeah, that's fine." So I went home and Googled him, and he's top 10 all time in the event and a two-time Olympian, right? So I was like, "Oh shit." Like I better figure this out. Like if I'm going to train, this high level sprinter, and my background's in basketball. So, I was training, it was going okay. It was a world championship year. He did pretty good, qualified, and had some injuries, right? And actually, well, a lot of soft tissue stuff, a lot of osteopubitis, a lot of chronic Achilles tendon stuff that we just couldn't figure out, right? Um, so I kind of vetted my network, and there was a name that kept popping up because I was like, man, I might need to outsource this, because my background's primarily in basketball. I don't really have much knowledge in track and field. So I got every book from, Jeffrey Dyson, James Hay, Charlie Francis, Tom Tellez, Dan Path. Started just gathering as much information as I could. And a name kept popping up as a really good, speed power coach. And, he had been the jumps coach for LSU for several years. His name was Coach Boo Schneckschneider. So we invited him to campus, right? This was the spring of 2014. And I'll never forget, we were sitting in my office, and I'd been working with Wallace for about a year at that point. And, we had force platform data. We took him over to the kinesiology department and had motion capture data at that point with the old marker based Vicon that took like an hour and a half to run him through. We had Tendon units, so we had velocity based training data. So we're just sitting in my office, and I'm running them through, and I was like, trying to impress him as a young, performance coach, on how we used all of this data to objectively make decision making. So he was like, "All right, cool. Yeah, this is all good." And seemed very underwhelmed. And he just asked me the question. He was like, "Well, what's his setup in the blocks?" I was like, "Well, coach, I don't know." And he was like, "Well, what's his flight to contact time during his drive phase?" And I said, "Well, coach, I don't know." And he said, "Well, what's his pelvic position and speed endurance qualities the last 20 meters of his race?" And I was like, "Well, coach, I don't know. I'm primarily in the weight room, right?" All that stuff occurs out on the track. And he was like, "Well, if you really want to help Wallace, you need to get out on the track and see how he's moving and see, all of these positions that he needs to be in to be successful. And that might guide and dictate what you're doing in the weight room, not the other way around." So that really kind of changed my thought process on how I kind of view my evaluation for sport performance and biomechanics. And just the overall nature of athlete assessment in general. It's like, the very specific centralized stuff of what their sport is should be the primary tool for evaluation and assessment, and then everything else should kind of peripherate out on more of your general spectrum, right? So that was kind of a seminal moment and a pivotal moment in my development as a biomechanist, sports scientist, strength coach. But something that's always resonated with me, and still to this day, is something that like I implore younger coaches to do, is just go and observe what their athlete is doing in their environment. And if they're having chronic pain in their knee or low back, or Achilles tendon, that's going to give you your roadmap and how they're moving in their sport, of maybe why those pathologies are occurring. Not necessarily saying that a very standardized repeatable lab based test isn't good, but it should kind of be a layer to what they're doing in their actual competition training, day to day in their environment. Outside of that, just the angular velocity, man. If you can run a sub 1000 or a sub 2200, the amount of the short ground contact time and the angular velocity, seeing that in real time probably took me at least a year. I had to film everything from different angles, slow it down. And still to this day, like I work with some, pretty good jumpers and vaulters. Not so much the sprints anymore, but the angular velocity at which they displace is just so fast that it's very difficult to see in real time if you don't have that kind of trained eye.
Hmm. Um, okay, wanted to go on Achilles, but I think it's probably better because one of your other areas is deceleration, and we were talking about some of your research because I'm thinking of your story. I kind of had a similar one with when I started with, well, not Division One basketball, and we had we had an ACL company come in and do a bunch of screening, and they saw that all the girls' knees were coming in when they were jumping. So our medical staff like freaked out, and they treated me like I didn't know what I was doing, like I'm not doing neuromuscular reeducation. And we had a soccer coach at the time who was really knowledgeable about the biomechanics and strength conditioning, and he was just like, let's kind of what you with you is like, let me go watch what they're doing when they play. Let me go watch what they do when they're in practice. And you see all these knees coming in like millions of times that it's like, okay, maybe there's something wrong with our testing or our idea on ACL prevention. So that was kind of a moment for me. I want to ask you on the, you're talking before we got on about this deceleration, and I know people have like this, probably this gold standard of deceleration. This is how you stop. But you were saying you see some differences with guards, with bigs, and how they go about decelerations. Could you get into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, around it was the fall of 2024. Um, Myself and one of my graduate assistants just kind of packed up with a 1080 Sprint and force platforms, so motorized resistance and force platforms, and just traveled to 10 different NCAA Power Four collegiate basketball teams. And we just wanted to look at multi-directional deceleration, right? So vertically, horizontally, and laterally. So we did about 24 different tests if you include right versus left on 5 and 10 meter ADA horizontally. We did a 5-5 lateral shuffle test with a right and left turn. We did 505 180-degree turn. We did a myriad of different jumps as far as counter movement jumps, single leg, drop jump from various heights, single leg drop jump, rebound jump. And we really just wanted to find, was there discriminating factors in elite basketball for deceleration in different directions. And what we found, after, sifting through the data is, yes, there are discriminating factors between athletes that are good at these tests and not good. I'd say the two biggest takeaways from this big project, we've already published a paper on the 505. We currently have one under review on the lateral shuffle compared to the horizontal deceleration in the 10-meter ADA. But I would say the two biggest takeaways or big rocks that we found were, acceleration, right? And the ability to initially overcome inertia and get in good projection angles is the barrier of entry to being good at deceleration, right? So if your athletes can accelerate and get in good positions and joint angles to initially overcome inertia, the likelihood of them being able to reverse that mechanism and be good in deceleration is extremely low, right? So acceleration in max ACell and just that tau one was a discriminating factor as it relates to being good at deceleration within this cohort, right? So training and testing and examining both is very important, but it's just kind of acceleration is the barrier of entry for deceleration. The second thing is looking at kinematic strategies as it relates to positional differences, right? So when you look at basketball, right? So sports like I think like rugby, American football, the degrees of variance based on position is body mass, right? Some have large body mass, some have less body mass relative to where you are at in relationship to the ball, right? Interior linemen are bigger, right? Larger body mass. Your skill positions are usually more slender, right? In basketball, that's not necessarily the case as much as limb length and height, right? So if you play closer to the basket in the traditional sense, if you're a big, you're usually taller and slender, right? If you're a guard, you're usually shorter and stockier, right? And what we found is based on these anthropometrics is that it dictated different strategies relative to deceleration, right? So our bigs, right, our taller athletes usually kind of grinded their penultimate step, used longer stride length, right? And bigger, wider stances, right? In the point of zero velocity when they had to change direction, right? Where guards had shorter ground contact time, choppier steps, but greater degrees of hip and knee flexion at that point of zero velocity when they had to change direction, right? So I think the two biggest rocks or the biggest takeaways is like acceleration. You have to be a good accelerator to efficiently decelerate, and then examining those positional strategies was really important, or looking at those differences relative to tall versus shorter athletes. There's a lot that we still want to look at it as it relates to performance and maybe some preceding how injury and prior injury may affect deceleration strategies. But that's for future prospective projects. Just from the one we did in college basketball, I think those were the biggest takeaways at this point.
Hmm. Do you look at so talking about maybe structurally with those the bigs and the bigs having those wider base, not getting as much knee flexion, hip flexion. Have you thought about this at all? What does this mean for like maybe like structural wear and tear on these type of athletes, the bigs versus smalls?
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. If so, if you can't flex at the knee, ankle, and hip, more than likely what your trunk is doing is going to go through greater degrees of flexion, right, and rotation. So athletes that are tall, as we all know, and longer spines, different, pelvic positions are probably more predisposed to, chronic low back pain, SI dysfunction, things of this nature. So if you obviously can't bend at the knee, ankle, and hip, you're going to have to flex and rotate at the trunk, right? At the point of zero velocity to go in an equal and opposite direction, right? So I think from a wear and tear standpoint is I think having a little bit more of ankle flexion and hip flexion at the point of zero velocity wouldn't be the worst thing for some of those bigs as it relates to them being predisposed to, chronic low back pain and low back pain issues. Um, as it relates to the guards, I actually think having a little more impulse might help, right? So what we saw, especially on those really short, stocky guards, is their ground contact times were so fast that a lot of times it would decrease stride length, and they would get in such degrees of hip and knee flexion that maybe it reduced some of the horizontal impulse in the penultimate and final foot contact as well as the pre-penultimate to where they could actually maybe use a little more ground contact time and a little more rigid penultimate step to essentially create larger magnitudes of braking forces, right? So I think those are probably the two is like maybe having a little more impulse as it relates to the guards and maybe a little bit more flexion from the ankle and hip as it relates to the bigs in the lead up to this point of zero velocity.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, okay, the other point you had on the acceleration setting up the deceleration. I mean, I can kind of imagine what a good accelerator looks like and then a good decelerator. These people that are bad at both, what type of qualities do they have?
Yeah, I mean,
Are they more like standing up straight, unable to get like shin angle changes or what?
yeah, yeah. So it's actually that's a great question. So yeah, essentially deceleration is just reversing the mechanism of acceleration, right? So, what we saw at toe off in the first and second foot contact is you want kind of like a perpendicular foot at toe off, right? A nice stiff, rigid, planar flex foot, and just projecting. Not necessarily at 45 because if you only have a 5 or 10 meter lead in, it's not like a block start in a sprint. But maybe, 47 to 48 degrees. So a nice forward trunk rotation and forward lean. And just, having a nice rigid, stiff foot, knee extension, hip extension, forward trunk rotation, all occurring at the same time, right? So there's just this nice line of, foot and ankle to knee, knee to hip, hip to trunk, right? As you project forward. Now, as you start to decelerate, you kind of see these shape changes where there's a gradual rise of the center of mass and acceleration, a nice stiff, rigid, perpendicular long axis of the foot at toe off in that acceleration, right? And then at peak speed, right, you notice that the shapes start to change. The athletes start to cast outside of their center of mass, right? They start having a rigid heel strike, and there's actually a posterior trunk lean, right? So there's a posterior rotation of the trunk and a casting and a heel striking at ground contact to create braking forces as they decelerate to the point of zero velocity, right? So during acceleration, there's a gradual rise in the center of mass, right? They hit a peak velocity point, and then as they start to approach that point of zero velocity and start to decrease their acceleration and reduce horizontal momentum, there's a posterior trunk lean and a nice rigid heel strike. And this should occur kind of uniformly. Actually, man, I have a pretty good graphic to demonstrate it, but it should be just kind of a gradual rise at the center of mass. You're hitting peak velocity and a gradual lowering of the center of mass as you decelerate, right? And then just sequencing those joints from, ankle and knee to hip, hip to trunk, and that cascade of kind of chain reaction should occur at the appropriate speeds and velocities. But yeah, very important. It would be easier to visualize that instead of me talking about it. But yeah, it's just a gradual rise of the center of mass and acceleration, and a gradual lowering of the center of mass and deceleration. Right. So stiff, rigid foot, perpendicular long axis at toe off and acceleration, and then a nice flat heel contact at deceleration with a slight posterior trunk lean. And if the athletes couldn't get in those positions, they probably weren't good at either.
Mm. And you didn't look at I'll put that photo in the notes. Yeah, if you can send it to me
Yeah,
so people can
yeah.
see the you haven't looked at pain. So I'm wondering, so my big thing is like anterior knee pain, and people with anterior knee pain, I think like acceleration, there's not a whole lot going on with XL, but it's when they have to stop that it really loads the anterior, that deceleration. Um, yeah, what would you speculate when you start having athletes that have, well, if we just stick to the anterior knee pain, are you going to see, obviously you're going to see deficits in decel. Do you expect to see similar things in acceleration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say right now we don't know just because we haven't studied it. But what I will say as an anecdote or an operation, this is not this isn't published, but it's just something we did as a brief scan. Like we just looked at major injuries of lower extremities for this cohort, ACLs, Achilles tendon ruptures, any kind of like surgical interventions prior to us testing. And this would be years before, because all of the athletes were healthy, able bodies. So it's not like they were in the return to play process when we tested. But it was a cohort of maybe 8 or 9 that had serious lower extremity injuries that required surgical intervention. And we looked at just inner limb asymmetry based on that, right? So, um, right versus left turning, right versus left decelerating. And what we actually found, kind of paradoxical in nature, but if you break down the mechanics of it, is athletes that had prior injuries were actually more efficient in turning off of the affected limb. So, meaning, like, let's say I had an ACL surgery on my right knee, and then I'm performing a right 505 versus my left 505 in the turning point. I'll actually be better at turning off of the limb that had the surgical intervention. And we said, well, why is that? Well, the magnitude of horizontal force is going to be greatest in the penultimate foot contact, right? So they're changed their strategy to actually put more weight on the trail leg at zero velocity. So they're actually putting more force through the limb that was unaffected. So meaning like your left would be your penultimate step and your trail leg in that like zero velocity change of direction. So if I had a prior ACL on my right, I was actually had a better uh total time to completion and a better just overall velocity time curve is what we called it in the 1080 study of turning off my right if I had a prior injury of lower extremity on my right. So it's something we want to look at as far as prior injury as it relates to changes in deceleration strategies. But what we saw consistently is that athletes that had severe injuries requiring surgical interventions were actually more efficient in a 180-degree turn and change of direction off of that affected limb.
Okay, my last show was with Eric Mara, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
he said the same thing with ACLs. Um, yeah, with these people coming back from ACL ruptures. Do you think it's because they overload that other side? That's what it is. They're overloading that side that wasn't injured.
I don't know. I think there's a myriad of different reasons that it could be. Um, I think in the return to play process, it could be, yeah, there's like an overshoot or an overcompensation to the contralateral limb. I think for just from a mechanics standpoint, like if you look at the ground reaction force of like the penultimate and pre-penultimate, that like if again if I'm in a 505 change of direction, right, and I'm turning off my right, just the amount of magnitude of ground reaction horizontal force is going to be greatest on that penultimate foot contact. So I can load the opposite limb a little bit more. And again, in that point of zero velocity, if you look at the weight distribution, I mentioned that medial trunk lane is going to be really important at the point of zero velocity. So if you looked at the weight distribution of lead leg versus trail leg, the trail leg is going to have the brunt of the weight distribution based on the medial trunk lane of the athlete as they go out of that 180-degree cut, right? So again, that could be it because you're kind of inherently offloading that affected limb.
Uh-huh.
But again, I think there's probably a lot of different reasons, but I think the penultimate foot contact and the point of zero velocity with that medial trunk lane and the weight distribution of like trail leg versus lead leg, that trail leg is going to have the more of the weight distribution at the point of zero velocity. So that might have play a factor as well. But yeah, as far as why that is, there's probably tons of different factors. And prospectively, that's something we want to examine in the future. So it should be a nice a good study.
Yeah. Okay. Let's backtrack a bit because we went on this deceleration topic, but the Achilles tendon. So you had that paper on, yeah, the Achilles tendon ruptures in NBA athletes. I forgot exactly what it was titled. What made you interested in looking into Achilles tendons?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It started, and the impetus behind the project was just a conversation. Myself and our former medical director for the 76ers were just, I think we were just at a hotel on the road one night, and we were just like, kind of from an observational standpoint, was just like, man, another Achilles tendon rupture in the NBA. I was like, man, it just seems to occur on these like kind of negative false steps at low, like center of mass velocity. You step backwards to project forward. Let's start researching this. So we just pulled as many clips as we could going back. I think the first one, Dominique Wilkins, 1992, and he actually had a good career after that. Isaiah Thomas, 94. So it was like early 90s is when we started pulling clips, and we just looked at, what are some common denominators or factors that were consistent among these Achilles tendon ruptures. And what we found was just, that false step was present in 100% of them. So this kind of low center of mass velocity, stepping backward to project your center of mass horizontally, was present in 100% of these Achilles tendon ruptures within the NBA. So that was one. The other thing that was quite interesting is that when you look at the foot position, um, in over 80% of them, the long axis of the foot was externally rotated, and there was a pronation and eversion movement at the point of terminal dorsiflexion. So there was kind of this tensile load from the fall step, right? But there was also this rotary component with what the foot was doing in relationship to the shank, right? So again, why that is, I don't think we know. But what we do know at this point is that it was present in over 80% of the cohort of the film analysis we did within the NBA.
It was present. So this false step was present in 100% of the cases, and
100%.
this
Yes.
this 80% was that turning.
Yeah, yeah. So there was a rotary movement of the foot at the point of the terminal dorsiflexion. And again, so when we modeled it out and just the methodologies within our study, this is where it becomes difficult. So we modeled out terminal dorsiflexion, right? And if you just took the average of just that kind of moment, it was over 45 degrees, right? In the closed chain, that's a ton of dorsiflexion. Our hypothesis was just not having the current diagnostics to know when the rupture actually occurred, is that that 45 degrees of terminal dorsiflexion, or I think it was 46.7, um, was actually, the result of the Achilles tendon already being ruptured, not necessarily the cause. Meaning, like, at that point in that position, like, the Achilles tendon it's already ruptured at that
Mm,
point. So,
mhm.
there's I talked to a couple of different researchers, and there's this thing called the twitch moment, if you can see it, that they've used in some previous research, but, not reliable. It hasn't been validated. So, we just kinda use that terminal dorsiflexion moment as just as a time point of just when it occurred, right? But our hypothesis is that the Achilles tendon is already ruptured at that point because you can't really use ground contact on the fall step because it's going to be a little bit different for everybody, and the Achilles tendon probably hasn't ruptured at that point. But our hypothesis at terminal dorsiflexion, the Achilles tendon's already gone. And you mentioned I got to go back to the Q angles and the valgus on the soccer because we did a similar study on ACLs, right? There's a couple of different mechanisms as far as ACL tears in the NBA, but what we found was interesting. And again, this is just a hypothesis. And I've presented on this to groups and gotten heavily criticized by the attendees. So I hope I'm not offending anybody, but we feel like that kind of valgus collapse or that medial collapse of the knee in an ACL tear is actually the result of the ACL already being torn, not necessarily the cause. It was more medial tibial rotation and anterior shearing of that tibia. And we say this because all of the research in ACLs suggests that the ACL goes very quick. We know this on cadaver studies. We know this in a lab-based setting. The ACL is going to tear between 40 and 60 milliseconds. It goes quick, right? What we saw in our film review is that the dynamic valgus moments in these ACLs are very slow, 80, 90, 100, 110 milliseconds, right? So at that point, the ACL is already torn. It's not necessarily the cause of the ACL tear. We feel like with this terminal dorsiflexion, it's kind of the same thing. We don't know. It's just speculation. But just again, something that we consistently saw in our film review.
Okay, yeah. So that short time frame of the ACL, but that time frame doesn't exist for the Achilles tendon.
Yes, yeah. So again, we just we don't know. Yeah, we don't know. The hypothesis is just that when you look at the timing of it, the timing's all very similar, but we just feel like it's probably that mechanism of the heel going into the ground while the foot's turning out. And then as the shank kind of travels over the ankle and gets that like 46 degrees of dorsiflexion, the Achilles tendon is already ruptured. But it all happens very quick, and we currently don't have the diagnostics to know when it actually occurs, right?
Yeah. Um, okay, so those 80% have that kind of rotary component. Those 20%, were they kind of like foot false step, but that foot was facing forward?
Yes, and of that 20%, they actually, of interest had greater degrees of terminal dorsiflexion. So, I mean, their foot was straight, but their shank was really close to the foot. So, like, they had larger degrees. And again, why that is, we don't know. Um, Still need to kind of figure it out. But yeah, that kind of rotary component was present in 80% of the film we review.
Um, okay, so yeah, that study, I'll have to post this photo on there too, because you had that graphic of that level of dorsiflexion, and
Yeah.
then I think combined with it, and I don't know if combined with it was like a knee extension, and then it almost looked like that. It almost looked like something going on with hip flexion with the other leg. Was that correct, or what were the things that were going on?
Yeah, so it was dorsiflexion at the ankle, knee extension, hip extension, forward rotation of the trunk, and then the lead leg was just knee flexion, right? Yeah,
Okay,
and
or the lead leg, the front leg was hip flexion.
yeah,
Yeah.
hip and knee flexion. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So that swing leg was flexed and forward. Yeah.
What did you make of that? Okay, all these guys, they have this false step and they're getting this, like, you're seeing this knee extension go along with that Achilles tendon rupture. What have you made of that? Why? Because so for me, or I've heard people say this too, is like you do that false step. in NBA, the knee is extending and then the thing kind of pops versus like that knee. Why is your knee extending as you're trying to like go forward, you know? Because like a projection angle would be your knee should be kind of coming down, right? Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I'd go back to we don't know because we haven't studied it. I will say that um, the mechanics of this, as far as dorsiflexion, knee and hip extension, forward trunk rotation, I think it goes back to being a good accelerator, right? So having a stiff, rigid foot, and then just the medial column of that foot upon ground contact has to be engaged to where you don't drop the heel and go into pronation and eversion as the tendon is lengthening, right? So I think having a very stiff, rigid first ray and medial column is really important. And you really made a good point, is like athletes are going to false step in basketball intuitively, so you can't prevent them from false stepping. I think what we can do as practitioners is when they do perform that maneuver, that they're in a really safe, good environment. Hitting the ground with a very stiff, rigid foot and making sure the heel doesn't drop and the foot doesn't turn out, I think is, vital. Because yeah, you'll never train a basketball player out of false stepping. Um, One interesting thing too is there's a researcher out of University of Bologna, Francesco Della Villa, and he did something very similar in FIFA and UEFA, like European football or soccer, and found the same thing, that the positions were very similar as far as dorsiflexion, knee and hip extension with forward trunk rotation. However, most of them occurred within like this false step in short confines, but obviously because the pitch and the field's bigger, you're going to hit higher velocities of acceleration and deceleration just based on the configurations of the pitch versus a court. Is that a few that he found, and what we found in examining some of the soccer or football clips, is there was a few of these Achilles tendon ruptures that actually occurred in acceleration, right? Where like a forward or wing was running down the pitch to try to get the ball or make a play on the ball in the Achilles tendon rupture. Now, if you took the still shot of around the time the Achilles tendon ruptured, it'd be exactly the same. About 45 degrees of ankle dorsiflexion, knee and hip extension with forward trunk rotation. But instead of false stepping, they had a higher center of mass velocity and they were accelerating forward. So still trying to figure that out. Maybe cleat versus sneaker, hardwood versus grass. Like maybe the ergonomics are a little bit different. Demands are a little bit different based on the dimensions of the court versus the pitch. But just something really interesting that um, the still shot of when it occurred looked very similar, but the entrance into that was very different. So I don't know, very very interesting. But I think it just goes again. Um, Good mechanics are good mechanics and they're universal. I think being good in acceleration or having a false step where you can get in a good foot position and good projection angles is going to be really important as it relates to mitigating potential risk of injury.
Okay. Yeah. Um, oh, there's so many. Yeah. The I question so many ideas around the Achilles tendon ruptures because I'm thinking now after you just said that that based on like I guess the strain. So they talk about the strain on the Achilles tendon and like having an ultimate strain. Maybe it's like 15%, and then you're gonna pop the Achilles tendon. Um, and that strain is gonna come from how much you get an engagement of the calf muscles. I guess like the voluntary contraction of the calf muscles, and then maybe the probably the angle of dorsiflexion as well. But I'm like, if you look at that running data with the calves, is like they engage quite a bit from like walking, jogging into like maximal velocity sprinting, and max velocity sprinting would be a ton of calf and Achilles. But do you see Achilles tendon ruptures in max velocity sprinting, or is that much more
Rare,
rare?
rare, rarely ever, and I think it again has to do with the position, because when you look at just max velocity sprinting, the ground reaction forces are going to be primarily vertical, and the trunk is going to be upright, right? So you're not really going to get in that forward rotation where the foot is posterior to the center of mass. It's going to be more upright. So almost all in acceleration, right? And then the thing about basketball that's so interesting is most of the athletes we looked at on film were in possession of the basketball. at 0 are low center of mass velocity. Either they're kinda like sidestepping into a false step, had the basketball, and they were initiating some sort of velocity to overcome inertia with the false step, but they were never just accelerating down the court or upright running, and the Achilles goes. The other thing, just being a student of track and field, is you see it somewhat in track and field in the jumps events where it's happened to a couple of very good high jumpers on the female side and a couple of good long jumpers on the men's side. But again, they start in a position of 0 velocity of center of mass. So they're standing there, they rock backward to go forward, and then the Achilles tendon ruptures. But you'll never see it. You'll never see Noah Lyles or Usain Bolt or any of these sprinters are not going to rupture their Achilles tendons in upright max velocity running, right?
Yeah, and it's because of that. Yeah, that force is vertical, and you're not getting that level of dorsiflexion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Um. Okay. Uh. What do you think? So, like, yeah, it really makes it more complex because I look at with, for example, like patellar tendon, and maybe that idea of like ultimate strain is good there because it's like you exceed the ultimate strain, you're going to pop it, but there's not this same because you see people pop patellars like really shallow joint angles. They're not getting maybe quad tendons happen when people get much deeper. Um, but yeah, with the Achilles, I wonder if does it have so much to do with the ultimate stress on the or strain the Achilles is going through, or is it more like this weird twisting component and like maybe stretching component with getting into deep dorsiflexion? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I do think I still think we don't know. Again, I don't think we have the diagnostics to actually have ultrasound on in situ human body while they rupture their Achilles tendon. That would be kinda awesome and a good study, but, like, we just don't know at this point, so I think as, technological advances occur, again, there's this twitch moment where you can kinda see it, but it's very subjective in nature and how you would, kind of classify that, but yeah, I think right now we know that, hey, that terminal dorsiflexion range is gonna be great, and there is a rotary component occurring most of the time, right? And 100% was, in the false step at low center of mass velocity. So, again, I think from a practitioner standpoint, having an eye for that and knowing maybe the correct interventions is gonna be really important.
Okay, I don't know if you looked at this. Probably not. This will probably be hard information to get, but the when did you look at where they've ruptured? Because most of those ruptures are like that mid
Yeah,
portion. Some of them are like really far down at the insertion. Did you look at? And I guess I've heard of some of them happening up higher too. But yeah, did you
no,
look at this at all?
no, it just, again, we can only go off publicly available data. So what we had the film, right? And this may lead into another good conversation based on another paper we did on the epidemiology. But we had the film, the game, the injury history of the athlete leading up to the terminal Achilles tendon rupture, and then we had all of their stats, right? So I mean, and it's been done in the past where athletes older in their career that sustain Achilles tendon ruptures typically have a decline in performance, right? So we know player efficiency rating, points per game, minutes per game prior to rupture and then post rupture, right? But no, we did not have any of the medical data to know where it occurred, what kind of surgical intervention, who did the surgery. Like none of that was really available for us at the time. It would be cool if, but again, they and for good reason. The league and the teams and the players usually like to keep that information kind of proprietary, which I understand.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I figured that'd be hard information to get. I even thought of this with NFL. How it's like there's so many they published there's so many more Achilles tendon ruptures versus back in the day, and I was wondering maybe I'm wrong on that. I'm like maybe they just weren't reporting it back in the day. Maybe the injury data was a little bit less. Okay, so you just said, and actually my friend Jess Ellis used to be in the NBA with the Knicks Blazers. I was at a seminar and he was telling me uh, I don't want to butcher what he said. I probably will, but he was telling me as someone gets older, more false steps. And I think you were getting at the decrease in efficiency leading into this Achilles tendon rupture, and they're all happening in this false step. Uh, yeah, what do you think? How do you think that's contributing? There's a decrease in efficiency in all these people that are going on to get an Achilles tendon rupture. Um, yeah, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I don't know. I've never looked at age in relationship to false step. I do think the number of false steps prior to Achilles tendon rupture is something we looked at as well, and r- a little bit of an increase, but nothing significant. So it's not something I looked at. The decrease in efficiency is a thing. What's kind of interesting is we had 8 Achilles tendon ruptures last year in the NBA. Originally, we thought age was a predisposed risk factor, and we still do. Um, the average age of an NBA player is roughly like 24, 25. The average age of an NBA player to rupture their Achilles tendon is almost 30, right? So older athletes are typically more predisposed. I don't know if that's a decrease in efficiency or if it's more of a structural type thing. I'm not sure, the reason on that, but we do know age is a predisposed risk factor. However, last year in the cohort of 8 players to rupture their Achilles tendon, I think the average age was roughly like 25, 26, right? So we're seeing some of the younger athletes within the league sustain this injury. So I think there's a myriad of different factors. I don't know if we'll ever have like a true concrete like predictive model to say like, hey, this is, exactly the components, but we do know false step, the rotary component, and age being, predisposed risk factors to Achilles tendon ruptures. But as far as efficiency, it's probably, yeah, it's an efficiency deficit, and there's probably some structural damage to the affected limb and the affected Achilles prior to rupture. I think it's probably a combination of both of those factors.
Yeah. Okay. So talking about last year, because you had that other piece of research on the epidemiology and previous, I guess, recent injury history that these people went on to rupture. Because last year, from the little bit I was around on like Twitter or whatever, it seemed like previous calf strains leading to these even years prior. It was just like you strain your calf and then they keep playing and then next the Achilles tendon is going to go. Um, Probably being hyperbolic with that, but what did you find in your research with the injuries that led into the Achilles tendon rupture?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We took the cohort of athletes we did with the film analysis on the false step and the biomechanics associated with Achilles tendon rupture. And then we combined with the data scientists from Microsoft that just scraped the internet for all the publicly available data for injury history since entering the league, right? So from their rookie year to the time of Achilles tendon rupture, we had their complete injury history. And what we found is 3 injuries kept popping up as being consistent as minor or moderate time loss injuries. So it wasn't a significant injury, but it was the one preceding the terminal injury of Achilles tendon rupture. And those 3 were calf strains, as you mentioned, plantar fasciitis, and just chronic Achilles tendon pain, right? And this was present in a majority of the cohort that sustained subsequent Achilles tendon rupture. So we took that group, right? So we took the cohort of athletes that sustained these injuries and ended up rupturing their Achilles tendon. And then we took an entire NBA season, the 2017-18 season, and we took all of the athletes that sustained calf strains, plantar fasciitis, and chronic Achilles tendon pain, and did not subsequently rupture their Achilles tendon. So we had 2 groups, a control group and Achilles tendon group. And what we wanted to look at is what is the average time lost of these injuries of the group that ended up rupturing their Achilles tendon, these minor and moderate injuries, compared to the group that did not rupture their Achilles tendon. And what we found was when looking at calf strains and when looking at plantar fasciitis, the group that did not rupture their Achilles tendon was out a longer duration of time, significantly more than the group that ended up rupturing their Achilles tendon. And the hypothesis being that the calf strains and plantar fasciitis weren't fully healed and fully returned to performance. Um, the athlete kind of rushes back to the court and then sustained subsequent Achilles tendon rupture. What is really interesting though is that in the chronic Achilles tendon pain group, right, of athletes that sustain Achilles tendon rupture versus those that didn't, there was no difference, right? And actually, when you look at the averages of the groups, the group that ruptured their Achilles tendon and had chronic Achilles tendon pain were actually out a longer duration of time due to the chronic Achilles tendon pain prior to rupturing their Achilles tendon. So they were actually out longer. And our hypothesis being that there was probably some sort of micro trauma or damage to their tendon, which caused them to be out a longer duration of time and then sustain subsequent injury, right? So very interesting. A lot of questions in there that we still don't have answers to, but we did find that, yeah, calf strains and plantar fasciitis, if you return quicker, could be a predisposed risk factor as it relates to future injury. And then, with the chronic Achilles tendon pain, kind of paradoxical to our original hypothesis was there was no difference. And in fact, the group that stayed out longer due to the chronic Achilles tendon pain actually ended up rupturing their Achilles tendon, right?
Yeah, yeah, a lot of questions around that. Okay, yeah, why do you so these things, like these injuries, uh well, actually, maybe clarify all those things there, that, um, this time loss idea. So you're saying that they had Achilles tendinopathy, and that's leading to a lot of time loss, versus if they just had an Achilles tendon rupture, it was less time loss? Or that's not what exactly was it?
Yeah, yeah. So we took two groups. So uh,
Group
a
that tore it and then group that didn't.
group that didn't. The group that ended up rupturing their Achilles tendon that had prior Achilles tendon chronic pain was out a longer duration of time,
Okay.
right?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. So when it was the opposite for the other two groups, right? So for calf strains and for plantar fasciitis, the group that ended up rupturing their Achilles tendon was out a shorter duration of time
Okay.
relative
So
to
yeah,
the.
yeah. So
Sorry, I
got
probably
it.
did a poor job of explaining that.
No, that's
Yeah.
no, it's kind of complex. So it's almost like they had the Achilles tendinopathy, in that group. It'd be better to just rupture the thing, and you'd be
Yeah,
out
I
for.
mean, yeah,
Yeah.
depending on perspective. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Okay. No, no, that makes sense. That cleared it up. I was gonna ask on the well, maybe on all these injuries, because there was one study on a track and field athlete, female, way back in the day. They had a video of her, and you were talking about that twitch. What was that term you had?
Yeah, twitch moment. Yeah, twitch
Twitch moment.
moment.
That's when when it pops and you see that calf, and right.
Yeah, it just kinda, like, curls up.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So she had one of the video. They had a video of her doing a jump into a sprint, which was like jump up and then off one leg go into a sprint.
Mhm.
And I've
Yeah.
seen people rupture Achilles like that. So like I've always been like, I just think, why do we do that exercise? Because it's like this really vertical thing into a horizontal, and just can put you in a bad, maybe the position we talked about, it can put you in this one position with a lot of having to take a lot of load. But anyways, she was rehabbing one of her Achilles tendinopathies, and on one side, and she went to rupture her contralateral side, the side that had no pain. And then I've heard of different stories too in the NFL of people with long-term Achilles tendinopathy, one side rupturing the other side. Did you look at, so when we talk about calf strain, plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendinopathy, um, and then going into Achilles tendon rupture, was it on the same side? Were some of them on the contralateral side? Was that something you guys looked at?
Yeah, so, it was typically on the same side. Sometimes it was contralateral, though. Again, this is kinda goes back to research and just trying to filter out, or standardize the how you're doing your analysis, is that we only took the preceding injury. So whatever the prior injury was, so 30, 60, and 90 days prior to the terminal injury of Achilles tendon rupture, just to keep the analysis standardized, right? Just to see if there's any trends. We did see in a longer, so we took those 30, 60, 90-day windows. When you look and when you kind of expand out of those windows and just look at, if you took a histogram of the injury history of an NBA athlete from entering the league to the point of subsequent injury of Achilles tendon rupture, there is a spike kind of like in injuries relative to that terminal injury of Achilles tendon rupture. But if you look back further, there was now 6 athletes in the NBA that have ruptured their Achilles tendon and torn their ACL, right? And of those 6, 5, it's the contralateral, right? So it's like one knee, the opposite tendon. So is that significant? I don't know. It's randomized in the occurrence of it, but yes, I think what happens on one limb, certainly from an interlimb asymmetry standpoint, can affect the opposite limb. We did not look at Achilles tendons on both those because when 100% of the time when it was chronic Achilles tendon pain was the preceding injury, it was the same Achilles tendon that ruptured. It was never a case of it being the opposite. But if you look back further upon time, there probably was a few cases where the contralateral Achilles was sore or they were out or for whatever reason, didn't compete or calf or plantar fascia, and then it was the opposite. It was never the preceding injury, except for one case. And that was a very rare case of an older athlete with a new team that had some like fluctuations of playing time. So it's probably different contributing factors. But yeah, for the most part, the preceding injury um, of calf, plantar fasciitis, or chronic Achilles tendon pain was in the same limb as the Achilles tendon rupture.
Okay, you said earlier the average age was pretty high of these Achilles tendon ruptures, but last year it was much lower. Do
Yeah,
you have any speculation why?
I think
Or I guess
if
let me do this too. Why, if there are more, because you were when you were talking to that guy from the Sixers back in the day, of like, hey, I think there's more Achilles tendons. Let's look into this. Um, have you looked at all that data? Are the numbers getting higher? In terms of what they used to be?
Yeah, if you bucket it by decade, yes. If you bucket it by half a decade, yes. There was a huge response emotionally last year to Achilles tendon ruptures because there was 8, and 3 occurred in the playoffs with like some pretty like max contract, high profile type players. Um, so yes, if you bucket it by decade, it is increasing. It's random. So the year prior, the 23-24 season, there was no Achilles tendon ruptures. So it's an average of 4, which is still greater than like if you look back in like the early 2000s. But uh, if you took like a histogram and a distribution of injuries, just time loss injuries in the NBA and how long athletes are out, and just chalked it chronologically. The season starts in October, the finals occur until June, playoffs start in April, right? It's a U-shaped distribution of looking at injury, right? So there's a big spike early in October and November. And then, prior to the All-Star break around this time, it kind of goes down. And then there's a double peak, right? Where it goes back up in, the months of March and April going into the playoffs, right? Um, so within that, there's probably, some fitness issues early in the season and maybe some fatigue issues later in the season. Um, but when you look at the 8 that occurred last year outside of one that occurred kind of mid-season, there was, probably 3 or 4 that happened early in younger athletes, right? And there was 3 or 4 that happened late with older athletes. So again, maybe the younger athletes didn't come in fit enough and prepared, and it went. Maybe the older athletes had chronic fatigue and, damage, structurally, and then it went later in the year, right? So I don't know. It's too small of a sample to really know, but I do know this, like, there are windows of, like, hot spots of spikes in injury, and it does fit that kind of U-shaped distribution where there's a lot early and there's a lot late. Again, there's probably hundreds of different factors that go into that, but just as an observation, uh, the younger athletes seem to rupture their Achilles tendon a little bit earlier within that cohort, and some of the older athletes maybe a little later. There's a couple of exceptions to that, but, but yeah, for the most part, it fits that distribution. And again, it's such a low sample size. that, it's really hard to say at this point. But
Yeah.
I will say, like, if you just look at all injuries in the NBA, it does kind of fit that, like, U shaped distribution of, like, double peak, one early, one late in the season.
Yeah. I have heard it in a different I have heard it to the younger guys too. Younger guys coming in, that's
Yeah.
the and maybe you see it with all injuries, all musculoskeletal injuries. Okay, have you maybe last question, we're at about an hour. So, have you looked at any of this in the NFL yourself? I know there's like some research there. Have you used this to like maybe try to find parallels?
Yeah, so Krill and colleagues did find similar findings in 2017, a really good paper if anybody wants to reference it. Lower extremity foot and ankle injury, season prior, was a predisposed risk factor to Achilles tendon rupture within the NFL. I think it was like in a 10-year period. Really, really good paper. So they found they had similar findings in a different cohort. What we're actually doing currently in a group with really good researcher out of Canada, Matt Jordan, and what one of his students is we're starting to we want to uh, same methodologies for our ACL study within an NFL cohort. So it is something we want to look at. Achilles tendons would be great. NFL is great for two reasons. Obviously, there's 11 players on offense, 11 players on defense. So there's probably a higher rate or more film that you can gather. Um, the one interesting thing is um, occlusion to the camera, so interior linemen that suffer these injuries, are it's gonna probably be harder to model out from a biomechanical standpoint. But I would be curious to see too is like just, blunt direct contact of ACLs and potentially maybe not Achilles tendon ruptures, but if you're an offensive lineman, like protecting like at left tackle and like you fall step and somebody's like hurling all of their mass into you trying to like sack the quarterback, the implications of that and like what the foot and ankle position are in versus like a skill position or, think about a defensive back is going to have to fall step pretty much every possession that they're, guarding or on defense against the wide receiver, right? And I'm probably not using guarding. That's my basketball background. But whatever the terminology is, when the defensive back's in a back pedal and has to change directions to project their center of mass forward, they're false stepping. What is the cohort of the group that does not rupture their Achilles tendon? What does that look like versus the group that does? So I think American football is really interesting because you could probably get a larger sample. So to answer your question in a long-winded way, yes, we are looking at this. These things obviously take time, but I think football is a really good sport to kind of do this with, just because the variance of positional demands on the field, and then what the athletes are asked to do within the competition.
Yeah, and I mean, you've seen some of those Achilles tendon ruptures with the quarterbacks. Like Kirk
Yeah,
Cousins comes to mind, where he's just doing
yeah,
like the most harmless false step in the world, and then he pops his Achilles.
yeah.
Um, yeah. Uh, do you see Achilles tendon ruptures in offensive linemen?
We haven't studied it. That was just that was something that came to mind because they're false stepping going backwards as somebody's like just hurling their mass into them. So I think like left tackle, like pass protecting. I mean that's essentially at low velocity, like that kickstand mechanism is pretty much a false step. But the thing is, it's initiated by the lead leg, not the trail leg. So that may be a safer mechanism. So they're pushing back to decelerate instead of the opposite. So yeah, I guess the initiation. But no, I've never seen one. But again, as we gather film, we there might be a couple that pop up there. So I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah.
Um, okay, what are you working on now? What type of research are you working on now?
More deceleration research. So we want to same methodologies as we did with our cohort in NCAA basketball. We're going to do here in the J League, just looking at 505, 5 meter and 10 meter ADA and lateral shuffling, and we just want to look at what is the variance internationally. So the training age of our cohort here in Japan is going to be different than the college NCAA kids, and obviously from an anthropometric standpoint and just a different area of the world. We have 3 international players and 1 naturalized player, but 10 of our 14-man roster is from Japan, right? So from an anthropometric standpoint and just from just a different cohort and population, can we replicate the same findings in a different population, or do we see different findings just based on all of those factors, right? So that's currently of interest. And then, yeah, we want to look at ACL and Achilles tendon ruptures in different populations, female basketball, so male to female. We saw some different mechanisms or patterns in ACLs and WNBA basketball compared to NBA. We want to kind of figure out why that might be. Um, and yeah, and then the NFL football. So that's essentially where my mind is at right now.
Take 2 seconds. Tell me what were the different mechanisms with WNBA versus NBA
We saw some on
ACL?
the trail leg. So Cameron Brink's one to come to mind, and Christy Tolliver, where 100% of the time in the NBA, it was, like, for example, like what we called a single leg cast or a pro hop. It was always on the lead leg as you were projecting horizontally or landing vertically, getting hit in the air. We saw a couple where there was a direct line drive downhill and the ACL tore on the trail leg, right? And we just didn't see that. There was 2 that it was kind of like a similar position that they were in, but it was always the lead leg, right? So we saw a couple in the WNBA where it was the trail leg, and we're just trying to figure out why that is.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Tell everyone where to find you online.
Yeah, just I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram, just Adam Petway. If you email me, adampetway@gmail.com, I'll get back with you. Feel free, any questions or collaborating on any projects, I'm always available. So, thank you very much for having me, man. You put out
Yeah.
great content, and as like we talked about, man, Mike Bowl is a huge fan of yours. So, anytime you get that praise, man, that's always
Yeah.
a good
Yeah.
thing.
Mike's great.
Yeah.
When are you in the States next?
I'll be playoffs are here in May, so I'll be home June and July and then head back next August.
Okay.
So I'll
Are
be
you
in the summer.
you speaking anywhere?
Uh as I'll do some in-services out on the West Coast and the Northeast, but as of now, no. And then my next during our FIBA break next month, or I guess this month in January, I'm speaking in Poland in the Czech Republic, but nowhere in the United States as of now. But
Yeah.
yeah, if I
Yeah.
do, I'll let you guys know for
Okay.
sure.
All right, man. Thanks for coming on.
All right. Thanks, brother.